Rationality can be defined as the quality of being reasonable, logical, and sensible. Does that mean, however, that being rational automatically means everything you say is right? If you know what I'm on about, then get the bullhorns out. It's time for the clash of the Jesus lookalikes. Yes, I'm taking a critical look at the atheistic-based channel Rationality Rules. Despite what my intro sounds like, the name isn't going to be my main point of contention, though being rational is an important part of what we're doing. That being said, this isn't name explained and justified. I found this channel a while back, and it's one of the many that inspire me to stand up against them in an organised fashion. On the face of it, he's your standard denouncer. I don't know his name, so I'm not going to make the attempt. He's taking an open look at regions of theistic views and ways of looking at the world, and presenting his views against them, and providing reasons as to why. He backs this up with a habit of putting the logical fallacies of his reasonings into the appropriate categories, which is not unreasonable. He furthermore narrows down the fields he's explaining and rarely uses catch-all terms or absolutes, though I have noticed he does that on occasions. All in all, a gathered and measured response to some people's wildest arguments for religion or the most blatant misinterpretations of either logical constructs or religious teaching. Does this mean his method of seeing the world is the right one? Not necessarily. I'm inclined to believe he's not as hardcore about it as some of us are. It's not just because I don't agree with him. It's because he's missed out a few things that puts his own assertions in question. And yes, I am going to break them down. Before I go any further, I'm going to say I've only seen a few of his videos, and whilst for the most part they all seem to follow the same pattern, I know full well my analysis is not going to be comprehensive. I'm only looking at the ones that stood out to me the most. Some of them are quite grievous. It may be a straw man argument, but then again, he seems to be picking apart the worst parts of religion. So whilst it may seem like blow for blow, I'll do my best to be as reasonable as possible. This one does a good job at narrowing down a workable definition for religion without catching other religion-based groups. Despite this, it does a general catch-all near the beginning, where it uses the examples of anti-stamp collectors as a potential religious pseudo, if you will. If, say, stamp collectors were getting aggressive about spreading the word of philately. But I think it's going by classic negative religious stereotypes, which, whilst not false by any means, certainly doesn't apply to the totality of any given religion, or for that matter, even certain sects within the religion. but ironically can apply to many more non-religious groups. I've seen many archer people get very upset when people don't use longbows, or get very upset when you're shooting the style you're used to, and they say, no, you're doing it wrong. Computer gaming happens all the time. And one thing many people don't even seem to notice is football. The fandom is rife with rivalry between various clubs, various football games. Granted, it's a competition, and therefore the competitive nature is going to boil over. But is there really any room for that level of violence? How many other events do you see with a police presence? Archer is weapons, for heaven's sake, and that is naturally a competition in most cases. Too far sometimes. Oh, and before you say anything, yes, a lot of people have questioned me for not being a football fan. I remember I was saying my boss quite a lot once, because I was simply making some arrows. My boss just came to the cafe with the Italian flag on his shoulders and asked if I'd seen the game that night. I don't remember if it was the World Cup on, and I definitely didn't know what game was on the night before. Either way, he was very upset when I told him I don't like football. So many people say I'm not living or anything like that. I don't care. I have strange feelings the same with a number of atheists and a number of people. But that's by the by. Whilst in general atheism isn't a religion, it's important to remember people within can act more like a cult than the majority of churches I've been to in my travels, and believe me, I've seen a few that can borderline a cult. There is a stereotype of religious people getting angry as people question them and refuse to learn. I found this on both sides of the argument. I've come across people who tend to refuse any form of learning and yet give terrible examples who in the Bible failing to back them up. When corrected, they're like, no, that's not how it is at all. Believe me, both sides of it. I have heard it said that atheism is a state of non-believing, literally not believing in anything, which on the face of it sounds more like depression. I think my favourite definition of atheism is actually a non-profit organisation, which is amusing. It really is. So really, all he's done in that video is emphasise that just because someone identifies as one thing doesn't automatically mean they fall into the stereotype. That is quite often the case with anything involving humans, not just those who say they're atheist or religious. He himself points out in other videos that humans are complicated. I remember seeing this and wondering at why someone would be arguing against the views, which basically says stay out of the fight. It's like yelling at someone for not joining the Black Lives Matter rally when they have a black flatmate who feels safe in the house. I'm not sure if he understands the stance he's taking against agnosticism, which is actually the same thing David Mitchell says many atheists do, arguing their own viewpoints against others who differ. Ironically, David Mitchell is right. Many atheists may as well be part of their own religion. I've seen so many people fall into that trap of trying to be liberals and then throw their own arguments into his faces. I've seen it on countless occasions, even with non-religious stuff, if he's anything. I've seen someone do a horoscope-based interpretation of the Bible and how the whole thing lines up, even saying that during the winter the Southern Cross holds the sun or something like that. I don't know the details off my head. I'll see if I can leave a link in the card to the video I did on that. I think it's selected. That's by the by. Whilst taking the New Age argument into the realm of religion isn't unreasonable, it does lead to a rant about religious people praying rather than seeking medical help. There's more of a generalization of you are A, therefore you do B. White fallacy. In this case, you're religious, therefore you pray rather than go to the doctors. Just because a number of people have made the news for being in that self-same situation doesn't mean it applies to the whole religion. And in fact, serves as a lesson to others in that faith. I myself have had medical conditions. I've had a heart condition with little. My parents were religious. They listened to the doctor. I had surgery. Major surgery. It wasn't pretty. I also had an eye infection, a major eye infection. That had to go to the doctors. A week in hospital. My grandfather fell, cracked his hip. He went to the local workhouse hospital. Nana, she was Catholic. She was suffering from Alzheimer's. Not Alzheimer's, sorry, dementia. I might be suffering from myself, actually. But she still went to the hospital. She still listened to the doctor. She still believed she had cancer at the end of it. Granted, I'm just using examples in my family, and I know there are people that would rather pray. Thing is, though, whilst people say the saying, God helps those who help themselves, it's not biblical and therefore means nothing. It's not just a New Age justification. It's actually something far deeper. If you look in the Bible, on two separate occasions, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, and Luke chapter 11, verse 9, Jesus himself says, knock and the door shall be opened, seek and ye shall find, ask and it shall be given to you. Not as in that order, I don't remember the exact order. But that tells you what you need to know. You ask, you seek help, and God will provide it. Not necessarily in prayer, because he's already given what we have. We have, here in Britain at least, the NHS. We have doctors, we have nurses, all qualified to take care of us. That's God's gift to us. Use it for goodness sake. He further tries to knock David down a peg by arguing that the communist regime that killed lots of people, seemingly more than most religious people, whatever, had nothing to do with atheism. I must point out that wasn't really the point he was making. The point he was making was that religion had, in your words, F all to do with it. I've heard from self-held atheists whom I'm friendly with that religion starts most wars. I've countered with intolerance starts all wars. And whilst religion can trigger the intolerances, I've said in past videos that the wars of the past 200 years or so have had little to do with religion. And interestingly enough, Hitler led a heavily anti-Semitic campaign and seemed to be motivated by social Darwinism. Yes, it's a twisted and distorted one compared to Darwinism of today. But let's face it, so was the doctrine that started the Crusades. And that was back when people did not have the capability of interpreting the Bible's teachings. They didn't have the option because the Bible was in Latin, only known to the learned people, namely the priests. So they couldn't interpret God themselves. Also, it wasn't needed to fight against the Vikings, who, as pagans, were more likely to be blacklisted by the Bible itself, because it did mention pagans or people that worship dark gods. And in actual fact, many of them converted to Christendom later on. Propaganda that whips people up against those they would normally happily walk past in the street without comment, or misinformation, can be religiously motivated. There's no denying that. But I know many people who have turned against Muslims, or even just people of Arabian heritage, or fear of terrorism. Yes, that is a religious argument, but if you want a non-religious based one, people of Asian ethnicity have been ostracized, beaten, and Lord knows what else because of COVID-19. I'm not going to say you have to follow my view on that. Just look it up. I've seen many, many examples of it across the internet, certainly the early days of COVID. I've yet to see any evidence of churches saying anything about it in the positive or the negative for that matter, implying it has little to do with religion, and I find it hard to imagine how it can be religiously motivated. In short, he's more often than not proven some points that David has made, in his reactions, if nothing else. So far from proving David Mitchell doesn't understand atheism, all he has done is prove he personally doesn't quite understand agnosticism, and why it's better to stay out of it. Whilst I'll admit his general view on agnosticism matched up very nicely, I'm more inclined to believe that you have a conviction that there being a God, you're more likely to be, well, there being a God, not being a God, you're more likely to be one or the other. But if you are somewhere in the middle, you're more likely to be agnostic because, well, let's face it, if you're neither one or the other, there's got to be something in the middle. Some people may say they're spiritual. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm not entirely sure how that works personally. That's just in belief in something that has a name of God. But since my brother and his partner are clearly raising their daughter to be agnostic, I don't have any qualms about it. I've used the argument that you can't prove non-existence. So, as this chap here. But in this case, he tries to use law of non-contradiction to explain how this is possible using the example of Russell's teapot. For those of you who don't know, Russell's teapot essentially says somewhere between Earth and Mars, or Earth and Venus, something like that, there's a microscopic teapot circling the sun. It makes perfect sense, and reasonably, we cannot prove it does not exist. But his argument says if it's entirely made of china and entirely made of steel, because it can't entirely be both, it clearly contradicts itself and therefore logically doesn't exist. His assertion isn't wrong on that score. But there is a problem with that law. Not only does maths at a fundamental level break this law, but it also falls apart in quantum mechanics. Because, well, specifically with Schrodinger's cat, because in theory, unless you take a look, it's both dead and alive at the same time, which surely is completely different states of being. So you can't exist in both cases. And there's another example, actually. In the classic quantum experiment, which proves light wave particle duality, the slot experiment, I'll see if I can get a graphic on the screen to show you, shows that if you're paying attention, it goes as you expect. When you're not looking at it, it does something completely different. Essentially. For all we know, that could be the same with the teapot. We think it's made of china, but when we look at it, it's shining in a way that suggests steel. In a way? No, not reflecting. Must be china. Whilst granted, he's proving that you can prove a negative that isn't the same as non-existence, which is really what he's trying to prove here. But let's pass over that and look at how it applies to God. Let's see how he uses this law of non-contradiction. He starts off with a general overview of God's attributes, including omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, omnibenevolence, and transcendence, with the addition of free will being thrown in. Which is a bit odd, because once he mentions transcendence, he doesn't really bring it up at any point throughout the video, and just puts free will in there as an add-on. But first, he claims that one contradiction is omnipotence, using the hypothesis that a polymath suggested. I don't remember his name, I can't pronounce it. He asked, if an all-powerful being can create something he cannot lift, then clearly he's not all-powerful because he can't lift it. But if he can't create something that he cannot lift, then he clearly doesn't have all the power in the world. This does take a big dive into what omnipotence actually means, which is something he doesn't allow himself to get drawn into, which is definitely reasonable. If you're looking at it in the literal sense of as per the definition, literally all power, you can see how this works. Since for one of my first ever videos I did that very topic, I'm going to briefly say that the literal translation is all potency, which potency itself is measured by how little is needed for powerful effect. This could put a new spin on the entire thing. But I have a strong feeling I need to do some more videos on the aspects of God, which I'll be coming to a bit later. Next is the argument that to have ultimate power, you must already have unlimited knowledge and be ever at once, hence be both omnipresent and omniscience, not in that order. I'd say not necessarily. I did say in a previous video that knowledge is power, not as literal as Terry Pratchett wrote it. You can say, because I have access to the internet, for example, and its vast stores of knowledge, that by that same logic, I am all-powerful, because I've got the world at my fingertips. And really, I'm not. Yes, I may find all the knowledge in the world, but am I going to be able to apply it? Am I going to use it? No, far from it. The idea of God being in the clouds and still affecting the whole universe applies to this as well, and implies that you don't need to be everywhere to have power over everything. And again, having knowledge doesn't mean you're everywhere at once. Whilst having ultimate power doesn't actually mean you are going to be everywhere. I would say that if you want unlimited power, you would simply take all atoms and turn to energy. Then you have unlimited potential for power, unlimited potential for work, but you're not going to be able to do anything with it because it's just a wild ball of energy. Complete waste of time. He uses the analogy of the sea containing water, hydrogen, and oxygen, and saying that since water is H2O, namely hydrogen and oxygen are its components, it's a waste of breath to name them individually. However, this analogy falls on its face quite quickly because anyone who knows how fish and other purely marine life forms breathe knows that there is in fact dissolved oxygen in the water. They don't get it directly from the water molecules, it's free-flowing oxygen that exists in the water. And since electrolysis can occur within water without it being completely vaporized at once, hydrogen can exist within water as a separate component. You could get away with other analogies, such as salt, for example, being sodium and chlorine, and therefore saying that a salt mine contains sodium and chlorine is a complete waste of time. But like I said, this one falls on its face. Again, a misunderstanding of the core meanings and how it applies. Ironically, he argues the same about theists. But I don't blame him for avoiding the rabbit holes. Still, if you're going to fell a tree, you need to have the roots sussed out and be able to tap them effectively. I will admit though I do need to delve into this more succinctly, so I will be doing a video on the aspects of God in the future. He claims the game-ending contradiction, however, is that of omniscience and free will. This, however, is a very solid argument that prompted my video into God in a Box, and further demonstrates his own misunderstanding of omniscience. He's saying that if God knows everything, that implies he knows the future. And if he knows the future, then free will is impossible. However, if you factor in free will, and even suggest that it's possible, then the concept of omniscience goes far beyond just knowing the future, but into possible futures, and alternative pasts and presents. So far from contradicting anything, it makes God far bigger than we can ever imagine. And when you factor in benevolence, it makes him far more benevolent than we can ever comprehend. It is utterly unbelievable. Finally, he tries to add that the contradiction of benevolence and omnipotence clashes with reality. Whilst, in theory, such a God would create the ideal world, he gives the good arguments from Epicurus. I don't know the exact argument personally. I need to look this up. But I recommend checking out his video for that, to be honest. The issue is he's missed out some important factors. First is that to ensure someone is always safe involves taking control over them. This actually bends omnibenevolence into something totally controlling, which, in this civilized world, we would shout down almost immediately. I mean, how many people say that traditional arranged marriages are plain wrong? The father's merely trying to do everything he can to ensure his daughter's okay, surely. He's ensuring that husband, that he has a good income, that he's willing to give some of his income to ensure he gets the woman. And yet people will shout it down. Same with other relationships. If the husband or boyfriend, or even the other way around, the wife or girlfriend, is too controlling, stepping in, constantly saying, no, don't do this, do this, and so on. That's a very controlled relationship, and many people say, get out of those relationships. You need to be free. And so many children have been destroyed by helicopter parenting that saying that love is the sort that we need just doesn't fly anymore. Seriously. If you're saying that the only way to see that God is loving is to have no free will whatsoever, then really, you're confusing yourself as much as anyone else. Taking control over someone's life doesn't mean it's better for them. I treasure my independence. And I would rather let any girl I love do the things she chooses to do, rather than force her to make me happy all the time. Or step in and make her happy every single day. If she needs the space, I'm willing to let her have it. That's just the way it goes sometimes. Second, it's forgetting that God is a father. And the best thing any parent can do for their children is give them independence, which means giving them the chance to do good in the world. The only example I can really think of is comparing a repairman dad with a child who he thinks should become a repairman as well. Thing is, though, the child has never had to repair anything. His dad automatically repairs everything. Shovels out, good. He gets up there, repairs it. Light bulb goes up, good. New light bulb. Computer's not working? No worries, I know what I'm doing. So he has no chance of fixing himself. Therefore, how does he know there's a good thing? And nothing in his life is broken. In this case, strange enough, if there was a good life, would this YouTube channel exist? And by that I mean Rationality rules. I'm not sure it will. Because he saw an injustice in the world. He's trying to fix it. Noble cause. Same with doctors. It may not be just because they're fiddling around people, not many people do. But it's because they see an injustice, they see something that they can fix, and they study for years and years to its people. And even they don't always succeed. Yes, it's immoral to let a child be born with bone cancer or leukemia, but how do we show benevolence to our fellow man if there's nothing bad in the world to fix? Bad things happen for a reason. May be a horrific justification for things being bad. But at the end of the day, if there's nothing bad in the world, how can we appreciate the good? If we have endless rest, how can we appreciate sleeping? Trust me, I know from personal experience that you never fully appreciate what a good night's sleep is like until you cannot get a good night's sleep. You can never fully appreciate what it's like to have a truly loving and caring girlfriend if you tend to wrap many girls around your finger. And you can never fully appreciate the value of having just a little bit of money if you've been flush all your life. So far from disproving God's existence, that video, in fact, proved the existence of God, in my opinion. And more importantly, made him look wiser, greater, and far more loving than anything we can imagine. And in this case, it's also given me the inspiration to go into further detail about the aspects of God. Which one we're going down those rabbit holes, but that'll be a video. Yes, I could delve into more of his videos, but I'm aware this could turn into a rant, and furthermore, he's spent 5 years on YouTube. And over those years, his views have changed. He's also done a couple of videos on that. One about his changing views, one about his views on religion. Since originally I wasn't entirely sure what his views were, so I took a look. Sure enough, he has a video. On taking a look, it seems he goes by the hypothesis of religion being used to bind people together in ancient times and used to control the masses. That is certainly the case, and has certainly helped bind large groups of people together. Here's the thing, I'm not an expert on first human creation stories. I'm inclined to think that the majority of them, certainly the ones I'm aware of, including Shinto belief, as well as Judeo-Christian, I'm inclined to think that groups tend to drown out the voices, since for the majority of those first human encounters, they are mostly single people, or just pairs. Hence, Adam coming to the Garden of Eden and Eve being created. Though I personally think, and I think the Bible backs up actually, that Adam went to the garden, Eve was with him all along, he didn't notice until away from him. We are weird people. Why away from his family? Why away from his group? Because the group tends to drown out the voice of God. Taking a moment to yourself, taking a moment to think clearly, God steps in and is able to call you. You will respond, you go your own way. Whilst there's no denying that religious propaganda is one of the most powerful and effective ways of getting people to do terrible things, it's worthwhile noting that the most famous example, that being the Crusades, was done during a time when the Holy Scriptures were in Latin and therefore only read by priests. They also say so many other things about other things, saying it's against God, where the Bible doesn't mention them at all. A classic example, actually, is I think it was a British priest said that crossbows were hated by God. Why? Well, because the crossbow is so powerful it could shoot a bolt through the finest armour, killing a high-class member of society. Well, hang on, you mean he's going to attack a member of high society? That's namely you. You're saying you don't have a crossbow. You can see why. That meant little in the way of fact-checking could be done back in those days. So if stated to be in the Bible or said from the word of God himself, he used to gainsay them. He also mentions that it was a time of ignorance. But I think ignorance is a relative term, since all that was needed to know by the everyday man was to hunt, nap flint, light fires, and do little fiddly things that make them seem to us as savages. But as I said in a previous video, so I'm not going to expand on this, it's worth remembering that the ancient Athenians were extremely democratic and artistic. They were also very open about gay marriage, I think. And even the Romans had military conscription and senates. It wasn't just a barbaric way of conquering lands. It was a proper republic towards the end. These views are not unreasonable from the perspective of an outsider. Since, however, the perspective of the heathenistic masters of pain and pleasure doesn't leave room for altruism being a beneficial trait. It's not based. The whole point of it isn't to be based on pain or pleasure. It's not to be based on getting something back from it. It does bring up the moral codes of religions being the basis for common laws, and certainly morality. Yes, they all have a balancing scale for good versus bad, but I would argue that's why religion was needed, and still is needed, regardless of one's belief in consequences. Without something to show one's evil deeds for what they are, we would in fact be selfish, cheating bastards. The weak being trodden down by the rich was noted in the Bible, and yet it hasn't been resolved, regardless of the advances of modern society. And in fact, charities, they don't exist. They can't exist in a world just ruled by pain and pleasure. Because we go through all the pain and yet see so little benefit. Now, he has changed his views over the years. After all, 5 years on YouTube, you're going to have some changes. So I've taken a look at that same video. Strange enough, the first thing he came off with was he claims having no religious affiliations can make the world of difference when following conclusions. Thing is, though, at least 3 other YouTubers have followed similar conclusions. Well, reached similar conclusions in a similar manner that they made when still looking for answers from God. They were open to him both ways. Just because you don't have any religious affiliation doesn't mean you can't be open to the idea of there not being a God. There's no reason not to. Both me and my partner are devoted Christians. Just because we accept God into our reasonings doesn't mean we can't draw similar conclusions to secular atheists. He expands on how his views have changed in some ways. I am surprised. larger views on total eradication of religion, the effective brainwashing of religious people, and his understanding of the reasoning behind creationism, all being torn down by his studies, proves to me that he's a reasonable person, as I know so many others on both sides who wouldn't go through studies and allow their minds to change, even sworn at. Now, naturally, there are some things that didn't sit well with me, as I said with the first one, so I'm just going to mention those. I'll do that as quickly as possible, as this is running late, and it is getting late here. Firstly, the Percy Shelley quote. If God exists, why doesn't he show himself as he wishes us to be seen? I have one simple question for this. What makes you think he isn't already showing you? Second, the human masters of pain and pleasure. I mentioned this earlier. It makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint, but doesn't explain altruism, which can be seen as the explanation for extreme goodness and seldom has any pleasurable benefits. Hence, the moral motivation is far more selfish than we think. Whilst he says Mother Nature gave us physical power or the skill to control how much pain or how much pleasure we receive, since he had to mention Mother Nature, it does instantly make you think, even though he's not religious himself, having a creator figure, it's an easier concept to deliver. That's as far as I'm willing to go with that, because I know full well if we go any deeper into that topic, it'll sound like, oh, he's thinking of another type of God. That's certainly that's actually the case. Thirdly, the multiverse. This isn't a criticism on his view of the multiverse, since it's just as provable in scientific terms as God is. But in a way, I find that interesting, that he has taken on a view that's just as rational as religion, if less centralised and based on a personification. I'm not saying this affects his credibility, as he's only slightly more convinced by the multiverse than God. Likewise, I'm more convinced about God than the multiverse. But I just find it's interesting enough to note that on a base level of how the universe came around, the only difference in our beliefs happens to be one tiny little difference in opinion. In my case, I believe that because the universe required a lot of things to in a rough sequence, it's far less likely for life to evolve on its own than for a god to be there and hence true at all. Whereas the multiverse theory simply states that due to how there's an infinite number of attempts, it's bound to happen sooner or later. Which makes just as much sense, really. So like I said, not a criticism against how that affects his beliefs, but it's worthwhile noting. It's just an interesting thing. While my conclusions are based on only a few of his videos, and therefore far from comprehensive, I'm inclined to believe that the same can be said for Rationality rules on religion. I don't know how he came to focus on the most negative aspects of theism as a whole, but I'm willing to admit his dealings with it and how he responds to them is both moderate and flawed in a number of cases. Since I've only reviewed a minority of his videos, and those are the ones that stuck out to me, it doesn't automatically mean that the flaws I've seen automatically discredits his channel as a whole, or the reasoning behind his views. I hope he sees that and understands that himself. And that on more than a few occasions he uses the logical fallacies that have apparently cropped up in his dealings with religion. The fact that he has taken the time to study and note the changes in his views, regardless of his feelings, is commendable. I'm interested in his response. Since I'll be leaving a link to this in the description of all his videos, I'm inclined to lay down the gauntlet to see if he's willing to respond. So, here's a gauntlet. Sir, listen. I have the same views as the majority of Christians. Have elements of New Age in my philosophy, or I'm a rogue element that no one else has ever seen before or is ever going to believe. That's not my concern. I'm only making my own studies and showing how they can apply in certain situations, as well as a whole. So, here's the challenge. Rationality with words as a study to a sword. I lay down the gauntlet. This should be interesting. Until then, my friends, may God be with you.